Hello, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Peace to all of you. Thank you so much for coming here. I know it's already been a long morning. I can see it on some of your faces. But when you pop outside of the room, there's a lot of enthusiasm, there's energy, there's passion. And so what I'm going to ask of you guys for the next 20 minutes, because that's all it's going to take, is to bring some of that passion that you have when you're outside of this room into this room. I want to feel your enthusiasm for our panelists who I'm going to bring up into the stage. My name is Malika Bilal, as you just heard, and I am the host and producer of a current affairs talk show on Al Jazeera English, and it's called The Stream, and it's centered on online viewer participation and feedback. And so, since that's my day job, I then couldn't do any other job that didn't include bringing in the voices of people who are in the audience. So while we're going to have a discussion here on stage, we're going to save the last 5 or so minutes for Q&A for you. So if you have questions percolating in your head while we're having our chat, please think of them, hold on to them, and we'll save time at the end. So without further ado, let me call up our panelists. Mr. Taimur Nabili, can you join me on stage? It feels like a game show. We can give him a round of applause. Taimur is an international journalist and TV news anchor with 25 years of experience. He's lived and worked in London, New York, Hong Kong, Kuala Lumpur, Doha, and Singapore. Over that time, he has edited, written, produced, and presented news and current affairs programming for Al Jazeera, BBC, CNBC, CNN, Channel 4, and Channel News Asia. He's covered major stories including the 9/11 attacks from New York, the Asian tsunami disaster from Sri Lanka, the Iran presidential election in 2009 from Tehran, and the 2008 Olympics from Beijing. He's now the CEO of Signal Asia, and hold on to that because we're going to talk about that. So thanks so much for joining me. Next up, we have Farah Naz Karim. Farah is an associate editor at the New Straits Times in current affairs, and she's also the NSTV editor, a journalism graduate and a firm believer that to be great, you simply have to do great things. She also believes that nothing should hold you back if you know your stuff. Until last year, Farah had been heading her newspaper's Special Investigations Unit, where she and her team went on to win numerous awards for their in-depth investigative pieces, including uncovering corruption and cover-ups. So thank you so much for being here. And then last but not least, we have Mohammed Nanabai. If you can join us on stage. Thank you so much. Mohammed Nanabai is the Deputy CEO of Media Development Investment Fund, MDIF, and a board member at Global Voices and also at Mozilla. He's also my former boss as the head of online at Al Jazeera English, in which he led the site's award-winning coverage of the Arab Spring in 2011. He also started Al Jazeera's new media department and served as an advisor to the Director General. So I'm so glad to have you all here on stage with me. Thank you so much for joining me. Our panelists today bring a wealth of knowledge. There are decades of experience on this stage, and they come from Singapore, Johannesburg, and right here in Malaysia. So let's get started. So the theme that the organizers gave me for today's session, I'm gonna read it out to you, just in case, but if you have it on your phones or in the program, read along. It's fun. In a world where videos are becoming shorter, audiences are increasingly fragmented, budgets are decreasing, and the freedom of journalists is jeopardized, how will traditional journalistic principles survive? So that is the stuff that would give any practicing journalism major, journalism student, or journalist something to fear. It's kind of a doomsday scenario there, but before we get into all of the bad stuff, I wanted to hear about the good stuff and why our panelists even decided to get into the media business in the first place. Taimur?
The reasons I got into journalism, I don't think exist any longer, to be honest. I mean, the world that we are now viewing in this business is utterly changed. So I'm not sure which question I should address. Why did I get into it, or what does the business look like right now?
Why did you get into it in the first place?
Because I'm argumentative, and because I have a bizarre obsession with getting to the truth of things, and because I like talking to interesting people. Simple as that.
So he gave you a little teaser there for why he thinks none of those things still exist. So I'm looking forward to asking you about that. But Farah, why did you get into this business? I know both of your parents are journalists, right?
Yeah, both my parents were journalists, but I fell in love with journalism as soon as I entered the industry, and the love has never faded.
Ahmed?
So, I came to journalism and media quite accidentally, because I was actually really passionate about the power of the internet, because it gave the ability, when the internet really started becoming widespread in the 90s and early 2000s, one of the key features was that it allowed anybody to contribute and anybody to have a voice. And that's how I came to media, because media was really the amplifier for that voice. It allowed people to tell their stories. And I think just being able to tell your stories is so powerful for people developing their societies.
Okay, so now we're going to get right into the bad stuff. Do you think that there is still room for that? Is the reason that you got into media, do you still see hope for that space?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's never been a more important time for journalism and the media. I think as we, this morning we were talking about the sort of authoritarian trend that's developing around the world, whether it's in the US or parts of Eastern Europe or parts of Southeast Asia. This is the time for journalism. This is the time for people to hold power to account, to speak truth to power, and to be able to dig and tell those stories. I think we've got a business model problem, which you alluded to, but I think that's quite separate from the craft and trade of journalism. And I think it's up to the journalists to be brave and to keep on telling those stories.
I'm going to create a little friction here because, do you agree?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean,
Tell us more about the no.
I mean, the business model problem is a massive problem, and I think nobody has even begun to understand how to address that yet. Mohammed's investing in a bunch of things, and there are many interesting models out there. But I don't think anybody has actually understood the business model problem at the fundamental level. But let's put that aside for a second. The holding power to account model is also at risk, but not, I think, because of this idea of authoritarianism making it more difficult. My biggest concern is that those people who in the past have talked about holding power to account are no longer doing it. It's not the authoritarian governments. We've always known what they're like. It's the governments in the countries that claim to be free and open and transparent that are actually working against being free and open and transparent that worry me significantly. There was a study just done in fairness and accuracy in reporting in the US, a non-profit organization looking at the media industry, came out a couple of days ago. Their analysis of the coverage of Venezuela has shown that in the past 3 months, not a single mainstream news outlet in the US has questioned the ethical or other reasons for what's happening in Venezuela. Every single news organization in the US has been advocating for regime change, which, as we know, under the UN Charter, is a war crime, right? Why are we not questioning that? We're sitting there talking about authoritarian governments going against the journalistic ethos. I'm rather more concerned about those people that we think are on our side.
So when it comes to questioning and not questioning, do you, Farah, see journalists doing their job when it comes to questioning authority and questioning the powers that be?
I'll look at the Malaysian context. We try as best as we can to do that. The new government came in mainly because of the slogan that they were running, transparency and accountability. So if to the electorate, those two phrases, those two words are very powerful and it's very sexy, and a lot of votes go that way because of those two promises. So as the fourth estate, I'd like to call it that, if the government is really true, is really sincere about allowing for that to happen, give us a tool. We're not asking for crutches. Give us the tool to do our job. what I'm looking at is the Freedom of Information Act. We had this in Selangor and Penang, if you remember years ago, but it was never the real sense of the Freedom of Information Act like what they have in the US. I was in the States for a while to study how it's a powerful tool to promote transparency. Basically, what we have to do is to dig up dirt. And I've experienced this myself when we dig up dirt and we put it out there. The questions, the authorities would come to us and ask us, who is your source? That's a no-no question for journalists. We'd rather go to jail. So let's make it easier for everyone. Speed up the introduction of FOI, the Freedom of Information Act, as promised, and I think it will do a lot of good for a lot of us.
You mentioned doing a story and then having authorities come to you about that story and questioning you, which raises the idea that it doesn't always have to be from the outside. Sometimes it can also be from the inside. And so sometimes we'll have bosses and editors who you have to fight to ensure that a story that you think is important sees the light of day. Timur, has that happened to you? Can you spill? Have there been times where you felt you were constrained? You don't have to, of course, name names or organizations, but where you felt the story that was important and the way that it was being framed wasn't the way that it was being shown either on air or in print?
I was working for a major international news network in the US about 20 years ago. And I went to Costa Rica to investigate the banana industry, which one of the major US fruit companies claimed to have cleared up. Because there was a very, as you know, the banana industry in Central America was a controversial and difficult area. And apparently had been, so I went down there and did a story on the situation. And the story was critical, I thought fair, obviously, but critical of the fruit company in question. And the TV network in question on which it was supposed to air did not in the end run the story as I had written it, and brought in a representative of the fruit company in question and gave them most of the time.
What did you do?
There was nothing I could do.
Has this happened to you, Mohammed? Or have you seen it happen?
No, and you know, one of the reasons our organization, the Media Development Investment Fund, exists is to help newsrooms and media organizations ensure that independence. So when we invest in a company, you know, partly we're investing for them to grow and for them to invest in their journalism and their businesses, but partly it's to help them ensure their independence. And when we come in as a shareholder, you know, our process is to really look at these companies and look at who the other owners are and investors, and to make sure there's nobody who's politically connected, no oligarchs, no one from the government or political parties. And then we'd look at the journalism itself, and we do an assessment up front and say, is this quality journalism? Are they producing journalism that's in the public interest? And once we've done that, and we've done a business due diligence, and we invest in somebody, we don't touch the editorial. We don't get involved. The chief editor will never hear from us. The business people will hear from us a lot because we're going to help them be sustainable, become more efficient, grow revenue, grow distribution. But you know, and there's very few organizations like ours who are there. But you know, but that's kind of our role. We want to make sure that journalists can get on with the journalism.
So one of the challenges that we're facing is a term that you all know, I'm sure, because you've all heard it, and it is. Arguably, it was coined in the US, but now it's found its way around the world. And so leaders in Brazil, Ukraine, Myanmar, other people are using it. And it is the term fake news. Timur, talk to me about what that term means to you and how you then think that people in the industry should fight the idea behind it.
I wish I knew how to identify fake news, to be honest. I mean, it's a really problematic area, I think. A few governments around the world, including the Singapore government, have actually taken legal measures to do something about it, having failed to actually particularly identify what the problem is, which seems to me a fairly problematic way of going about these things. I don't have any answers. I don't think fake news, I mean, I would make the case that there's a good debate to be had that there's no such thing as fake news. Fake news is just what you don't want to hear to a large extent, which is utterly unfair because I know of plenty of instances in India, for instance, where there has been some really dramatic impacts from people spreading nonsense. And the internet has amplified a lot of the damage from that. But I don't think that the sledgehammer approach is the way to deal with this.
What's the view from Malaysia?
There has been a very clever way devised by certain groups. I'll be specific. For instance, like crime cells, right? It's great news for us. So the Royal Malaysian Police has, their Facebook account has 2 million followers against ours of about 700,000. So whenever they hold a press conference or whenever there are issues that could end up as fake news, tweaked here and there, they put it out first. And their followers are actively sharing all this. The same goes for government agencies. Their comms team are very aggressive in putting out news that's going to be presented, that has just been presented. But of course, all this, that's positive. It's at our expense, of course. We lose out on this news.
So, I think the first thing is, I just like us to not use the term. Because I think the term empowers those who want to suppress journalism or just general critique of government power, and they use it to cast anything they don't like as fake news. And I think you listed a bunch of countries, and there's many more. So it allows somebody to just, you don't like an idea, call it fake news. But I think there is a real problem when we want to talk about propaganda, misinformation, disinformation that's happening. And because of social media, it can happen at a sort of massively distributed scale. And I think we're still grappling with how do we deal with that, and how do we deal with how this information spreads on these social networks. One of the smartest things I've seen recently was Samir Patel from Scroll in India, who talked about dealing with this not as a computational problem or media literacy problem. And part of it is both of those, right? But he says, we need to deal with it like a public health crisis. So it's holistic, and we're looking at both how do we educate people, how do we deal with some of the symptoms, how do we deal with some of the sources.
I mean, do we call it a crisis at all at this point? I mean, I kind of like to think about if we framed it differently, we might actually address it differently. The idea that somehow people have different opinions and some people want to cause trouble is not a new one. The only novelty to this is the fact that the internet spreads it much faster, further, and with greater impact. The problem, to a certain extent, I think, lies in the fact that we have devised systems for news that are rooted in a society and an infrastructure that no longer exists. Let me give you an example. We had a panel earlier on about education, and we talked about disruption and how everything is new. Education is theoretically something that the internet should have disrupted years ago, and yet we still have schools, we still have desks, we still educate kids in exactly the same way. The institutions on which we live our daily lives and which govern how we behave are still the same, and the media is one of them. The reality of fake news is that all of a sudden we have a capacity to actually involve lots of people in the conversations that we have. We just don't know how to do it. If we start devising models that allow people to engage in the conversation as the stream did, and the weird thing is when you started the stream, what was it, 10 years ago?
8? Maybe 8?
Al Jazeera started this program called The Stream, and they had people calling in and messaging, and everyone went, wow, that's cool, people are participating in the news. The fact that nobody else is doing it, it baffles me. Why are we not devising ways where more smart voices can shape better informed conversations in meaningful ways, rather than spending our whole time saying, how can we shut people up more?
I think that's a great question, and we are almost out of time, but I wanted to lead for one more question for the panel before we open it up for you guys. But in speaking about social media and in speaking about shaking up this model, what do we do about the fact that the old model has gone away and we have not yet figured out a new one, especially in the face of algorithms that are shaping what news we see and what news we don't see. You want to take that one on first?
Sure. So, I think there are two things that we're grappling with, right? One is there's a business model problem. And because of the ad industry being disrupted as ads have gone online, and Google and Facebook are taking a larger and larger share of the advertising market, up to 80% in some countries. Traditional media, whether it's print, magazines, television, have started seeing declining revenues, and they've not been able to replace those revenues. I think we're not at the bottom of that yet, and I don't think there's going to be a quick solution. I think the only thing we can do at the moment is almost think about what do we patch ourselves with, or how do we manage our way through it. So when we come out of this business model crisis, we still have some semblance of the journalism we want. And part of that is running leaner operations, not having the sort of, because, in a way, the magazine industry had a monopoly on advertising, right? If you were a small independent publisher, you never accessed the sort of brands and markets that they would. So some of that disruption is good. You've got new people who have emerged. You've got Malaysia, Kini here in Malaysia, who wouldn't have emerged if it weren't for the internet and for Google being able to bring them ad revenue. So I think it's tough, but people just need to sort of tighten their belts and manage their way through. One of the things we're seeing with really smart newsrooms and media organizations who are managing their way through this is not relying on one revenue source. So it's not just advertising, it's advertising plus some events, plus reader revenue, and almost having a couple of pillars to their base. So, they can see their way through it. But, I think we often talk about the big media companies in this, but it's really the small media companies in many of these developing countries who are really facing the brunt of it, because they've got both the business model problem, and then they've also got, governments who are really, really hostile to them. But of course, Temo points out all governments are now becoming hostile to media.
Okay, so I wanted to give time, as promised, for our audience before we wrap up this panel. So there's a microphone going around. If anyone has questions, I see a hand there, and I think a microphone is coming to you right now. So we're going to start there. We'll start there, and then we'll go to you.
Yeah, okay, thank you for this valuable discussion. Mohammed Khamasa from Al Jazeera. I might disagree with some of what have been said. Fake news is a new era happening with this post-truth era we are facing now. And the main idea here that what changed the media is the death of local journalism. The local journalism, when it's start to transforming from newspapers to social media accounts and these things, and the media outlets who was survived eventually, it was just like the international media outlets, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and etc. What happened there is the partisan media have come to the surface, and the fair, not objective media, turned to dead. That's a problem now. We are facing with this specific dilemma that we are already. Back then, we know what the agenda of these news outlets were. We know Fox News what their agenda. We know the BBC what their agenda, etc. But when the newspapers, the local newspapers, have been replaced by these new social media accounts, social media pages, pretending to be a local journalism, didn't know what exactly their own agenda, their own funding, and their own partisan acting. So we are starting to fall in this manipulation. So actually, I can say it in a phrase, we lost our remote control on media. We cannot anymore decide what channel we will listen to. That's the big problem now in media.
That's a quotable there, so I'm going to direct that to our panel. The death of local media really was the first downfall. Who wants to take that one on?
I think, yes, there's a problem. We need more local journalism, and it's important. But I also think this nostalgia we have for this previous era isn't helpful. And not just because, it's in the past, but also it didn't exist. I mean, if you think of this part of the world in the Middle East, there's never been a better time for media. I mean, I'm old enough to remember where every news story on an Arab TV station was the president or the king kissing babies, right? So, like, I'm not sure what nostalgia people are reaching for in the past where things were better.
There's more time to chat afterwards because I see that you have more to say. But the next question's right here down the center.
Okay. My name is Dania, and I am personally a mass comm student. All right. So my question would be, does the trust of the public depend on the ownership of the media, whether if it's independent or if it's dependent or owned by a government or a political party?
Trust of the media. Where does it come from, Farah?
Okay, how do I say this? Basically, in the local context, I'll go with local context. Probably Timur can talk about it more from a bigger context. The ownership is always there, and I am a strong believer that politics and media should never mix. But sadly, that is quite the case for us. But we are, in Malaysia at least, we are very hopeful because the present government has promised us that there'll be no interference in the media. So for as long as we are holding them true to their word, we will go that way. So hopefully we'll be as independent as we're expected to be.
Right, that's it. Thank you.
Any other questions? One hand raised in the center.
Hi, my name is Sabri. Just to clarify some points, as I have observed that Al Jazeera is being pressured a lot. Why do you think specifically Al Jazeera is being pressured by other parties?
Good, succinct question. Since I'm the only one that still works there now, I'll take this on. I think it's the same reason that they've always been pressured. From the beginning of Al Jazeera, they were pressured. People don't like, especially governments that operate in the dark, don't like when people poke around with a flashlight. And that's true of Al Jazeera, that's true of any other media organization that's doing that poking around. And so I don't think that will ever stop. I don't think anyone will ever get on board with all media organizations. But that's just the nature of the game.
I would question the assertion that it's just Al Jazeera, though. Russia Today, RT as it's now known, is coming under tremendous pressure. The British government, the US government are working hard to ban RT from even being on the airwaves. They're really being demonized. Al Jazeera, you know, we had that problem at launch more than 12 years ago, whenever it was, the English channel at least. But I think the pressure since then has lessened considerably.
Probably time for one more question. No, I'm so sorry. But all of our panelists will be here, so you can chat with all of us after. I'm going to give, in our wrap-up, rapid fire, 30 seconds or less, because the title and the theme of this conference is Own Your Future. And so I wanted to give some advice from all of our panelists very quickly for someone who's out there and wants to become a journalist or wants to become one of you, wants to do what you're doing. What advice would you have for them? Say more.
Holy cow. Solve the problems of journalism in one quick sentence? Is that what you're asking me?
Yes, it is.
Look, journalism, Mohammed described at the very beginning, journalism is about shining a light in places where people would rather not be seen. And I agree with Farah to a certain extent. Politics and media shouldn't mix. I wish we would go to a time when we didn't have journalistic media empires. We had politics reporting and national interest, common interest reporting on matters of politics and state and governance was a journalistic, publicly funded institution, and the rest is media. The rest is entertainment, the rest is current affairs and all that kind of stuff. If you want to get into journalism today, you have to decide which one of those two worlds you want to live in first, and then find who does it best.
Synced. Farah, advice.
Okay, I think aspiring journalists, the last thing that they should be worrying about is this overused term of digital disruption. Media houses that you will be entering are addressing this quite well. They have been doing it for the past 5 years. They will be doing it for the next 5 years at least. But to me, I'd like to look at the basics before you enter this job market. That is to prepare yourself as a good journalist. At the end of the day, good journalism will survive. We have seen stories which concern the people, which are of interest to the people, spike in numbers. So prepare yourself, get used to being in front of the camera, learn to know your subject matters well, so that when you speak about it, you speak with conviction and there's no reproach to your story. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Well, I think one of the things, when we say own your future, I think going into journalism, there's not many barriers for you to do this. I think it's, the barriers have come down, so it's quite easy to get into the profession. If you look at, Malaysia itself, one of the biggest stories that, led to this change in government, the 1MDB scandal that unfolded, was, by a lone journalist writing her blog, right, on the Swarak report, who initially got the information and, disseminated it. So I think there's a lot of power that you have. And the good thing is about becoming a journalist, as much as we talk about business models and the media industry going through these tough times, that shouldn't concern you as a young journalist, because no one goes into journalism to make money anyway. And that's how it was during the glory days of journalism as well. So it's just like going into academia. You go in because it's the public good. Go ahead, make your mark. Pick up your phone. Now that's all you need to start publishing.
Fantastic advice from our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, we'll be available to chat afterwards outside. Thank you. Sanam.